Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Patient Engagement Open Forum. So if you're just joining us, we're very excited to have you here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today, we are going to be talking about patient engagement, or PE, in digital health and digital health data. So Diana, if you could bring back those slides for you. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers today. Gus Deyes from Data Saves Lives and EPF, Robin Bent from the US Food and Drug Administration, Jan Geisler from Advocates, and Ray Pinto from Digital Europe. In addition to me moderating, we have Nicola, Executive Director of PFMD, and my name is Elizabeth Priest. I am a Program Manager for PFMD. So before we get started, a quick recap on our agenda and some housekeeping rules for today, of course. The whole goal of today's session is to really feed into an ongoing PFMD initiative on patient engagement, also known as PE, in digital health and data. So we're going to walk a little bit back through previous patient engagement open forum sessions. This is now our fourth. Then we're going to speak a little bit to this ongoing initiative that we have called a Stakeholder Expectations Matrix. We're going to have a panel discussion where we hear from our amazing speakers about what is their point of view regarding patient engagement in digital health. Then we want to hear from you, the audience. We have a great turnout today in registrations where we're going to be asking you for your input and help us shape the next step of our initiative, really building on PFMD's Stakeholder Expectations Matrix together. And then we'll just quickly recap and let you know how this is going to feed into the next step and next evolutions of our project at PFMD. Before we get started, next slide, please. A little information about the Patient Engagement Open Forum, also sometimes called the PE Open Forum or PEOF. We are a series of virtual and in-person events where we're working together to engage with you, the audience, in a multi-stakeholder context, trying to build towards stronger patient engagement. What makes this different? Well, we're not presenting to you today a finished initiative. We're really working on initiatives in progress so we can collaborate and co-create with you as the audience in order to form the next step in this initiative. Next slide. So please be present and engaged. We're asking for your input in our project. So close your emails, ignore the Slack message. You are muted, but this does not mean that we're not actively engaging in this as a community. So feel free, add your name, add your location. As I mentioned, we should have a great turnout today. So please feel free to use the chat to say where you're from, where you're coming from, who you are, so we can really foster this sense of community today as we're going through together. In addition, feel free to add your comments and feedback for our speakers and panelists and for myself using the chat and the Q&A function. Lastly, this session will be recorded. So we will make the recording as well as the slides and all of the reference materials today available after these PEOF sessions. Next slide. So I want to start off today with two angles. One is what we've done so far for digital health at the Patient Engagement Open Forum. As I mentioned before, this is now our fourth session. We've gone broad about how to connect patients to digital health, narrowing in on aspects like building a responsible data model and making health data accessible in December. And now we're taking it one step forward, trying to build a next evolution and keep that red thread going through all of the information that we've learned and gathered with all of you so far. So the second aspect in the next slide is PFMD's systematic approach to co-creation. I say this because I don't want you to think that this is where the co-creation ends. These patient engagement open forum sessions are part of a landscape and needs analysis, gathering input, and really looking at the broader view with a literature search review to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, that we hear from you, the audience, that we hear from patients and have that engagement. Then from here, everything that we talk about is continued to be co-created in a multi-stakeholder environment where we pilot, we capture lessons learned, and then ultimately all of the tools at PFMD are made available through our patient engagement management suite for free to everyone. Next slide. So where does this bring us? Your feedback has directly led into some of the ongoing initiatives that we have at PFMD as part of our patient engagement and digital health. We heard about capturing resources in April. We had heard from you about the importance of a patient-centered data model in June. And then now we are taking on our stakeholder expectations matrix, which is a methodology that we have applied for patient engagement in medicine's development. And we're using that today to address something we heard from you in December, which is the lack of clarity around the how, the what, and then with whom to engage regarding patient engagement in digital health. So with that, that's really going to be the focus today on the stakeholder expectations matrix. We're going to hear from our speakers to set the scene, and then you're going to help us build that content. But first, let's learn a little bit more about what this matrix is. So I'm going to hand over to Nicola Brooke.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, everybody. Nice to see in the chat that we have people coming from everywhere around the globe. So good to have this discussion with you, and we can go to the next slide. So basically, when we talk about patient engagement in digital health, actually, most of the time we all have the exact same goal, which is to improve health outcome for the patients. And if you have one click, it's when we see now how we get there, it's where we have some differences. And we have seen an environment, and we see an environment which is very complex. And on one side, there are plenty of technology and industries pushing for these technologies, AI, metaverse, blockchain, all the buzzwords that we know. On the other side, we also have big questions around data, the primary use, secondary use of data, data sharing, privacy, patient rights, all these aspects that we still have to deal with, and the interoperability of all these tools aspects, and I didn't even mention the devices yet. We also have a very fast-moving policy environment, or at least things are moving in some regions of the globe on that front. And so actually, how does that come together is a question, and how do we solve issues? And I remember working already in the digital sphere over 10 years ago. The buzzword at the time was big data. And I think all the questions related to data, privacy, and these ones were there already at that time, and we still have not solved them yet. And so what I would like to see as an idea is that maybe a little bit like I see it's happening for patient engagement in drug development and other health systems, the patient perspective might be the red thread to help us actually aggregate all these issues and how we can address them in a meaningful and coherent way and deliver this final outcome, which is a better health outcome for patients. So we can go to next slides. So for that, the approach of the stakeholder expectation matrix is, yes, we agree we have the same goal, but how do we get there? And so to understand a little bit more where we start from, the idea is to ask all stakeholders, what are we going to do and what do you expect from others? And if I come back over more or less 7 years ago now, you can see on this slide the fragmentation of the patient engagement environment. We were talking at the time only about drug development. One of the issues identified to make patient engagement happen was actually what do we mean by patient engagement? What does that mean across the life cycle of medicine development? What does that mean in different regions of the globe? And you will see that we found out after, like, who is in charge of that? Who has to make it happen? Who is the leader to actually make sure patient engagement becomes the norm? And actually, there was a lack of leadership. And how we found out is through the stakeholder expectation matrix. So can you go to the next slide, please? So the principle behind the stakeholder expectation matrix is like not only to say what we want to do and what's right or what's wrong, but just to try to understand what are the the respective perspective from each stakeholder group and to try to answer, okay, for you, what does that mean? What are you trying to achieve? What is the language you use when you are doing that? And then from there, from your perspective, where are you within your stakeholder group? And what do you think should be the next steps? And finally, when you know what you want to do, what are the expectations you have from the other stakeholders to help patient engagement to happen? And just as a reminder, we did it in the drug development context at the time. Next slide, please. And so basically, what does it look like when we look at it is like we ask each stakeholder group to ask, okay, patients, what are you expecting from healthcare professionals? But then later on, we will ask healthcare professional, what are you asking from patients? And when we start to go into that granularity, actually, we start to find out many different perspectives, but also to understand, okay, what is the real need from healthcare professional in this context, or from pharma in this context, from regulators in this context. And so we can click to the next slide. We actually can feed, and we have a lot of information as a result of that. So the process is simple. So we have surveys, and then we have phone interviews to try to enrich the initial content. And that's exactly what we'll be doing in the digital health environment. And we will start with you to feed that matrix today. But that's a poster outcome of it. The actual publication is much richer than that, but you have the headline in the poster, and I will not go into the details of that. But one of the things what was very clear is that no stakeholder group felt he was accountable to make patient engagement happen. Everybody was ready to contribute, but actually 5 of the 7 stakeholder group we were asking pointed at industry and regulators to make patient engagement happen. But industry or regulators didn't feel they were the one owning that responsibility. And so that's where we came to the multi-stakeholder environment to try to solve this together and try to address all issues or all challenges from everybody's perspective. And that was actually a very fundamental piece of work for PFMD to drive our strategy and to inform our strategy moving forward. And so next and last slide for me to set the scene. So as we get into this, I also would like to point out what I think I've called that the great illusions for the sake of this presentation. But I also believe that when we talk about patient engagement in digital health, there is something very different with patient engagement in other spaces. Because in digital health, the digital industry, very often there is this belief that because it's considered user-centric, actually there is a shortcut to say that it's also patient-centric. And I think where we come from in this community, what we mean by engaging the patient community, whether it's in regulatory affairs, whether it's in drug development, devices, actually we mean something much deeper than checking which button a user click on the screen. And so I think we are confronted to a situation where not only the need maybe is not there to engage with patients, but there is a belief that we are doing it already in the digital industry. And so that's something that we will have to overcome. So to start this difference of perception from different stakeholder group, I think we talk to an industry which is not necessarily on the same page as we are in this community in terms of what do we mean by patient engagement. And I stop my little introduction here. Elizabeth, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. So I think that was the perfect way to set the stage for what we're doing here, what the goal of the stakeholder expectations matrix is, how we've used it in the past. And now we really want to set the scene by hearing from our great speakers about what's important for them right now related to patient engagement and digital health data, give their point of view, and then also speak a little bit more to their expectations. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Jan. Jan, would you please introduce yourself and feel free to take it away?
Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and also Nicola for your introduction, which is great. And thank you for inviting me to this panel to speak from the perspective of patients in terms of their expectations on the involvement of fair use of health data. Just about myself, I'm CEO of Padvocates, a think tank on patient advocacy and patient engagement. But first and foremost, I'm a cancer patient who's been a cancer patient for about 20 years. And I've also, in those 20 years, been involved in a number of patient organizations. We have developed our own apps to track adherence. We've run forums with 10,000s of forum posts where patients shared their experience, their stories, their questions, and so on. And I've been actually 28 when I was diagnosed with cancer. So I was also quite a young patient in my community. And of course, digital and health had a strong role for me and for my community, of course. What I'm trying to speak about is a bit about setting straight what patients expect, because it came a bit out of what Nicola said in the beginning, is that we very often design things for patients, but not really with patients. So why do we provide our data? So if you go to the next slide, I just like to raise the bar and say, this is not actually why patients have shared their data, because that's very often how patients feel. They join clinical trials, they download mobile apps, they join online forums, and they share that because they see value in sharing and they see value in receiving things. And they, of course, see value also in improving healthcare and improving research, but that's secondary to their personal value and their personal expectations on their own patient journey. What we often experience in digital is that those that run the apps, those that run the trials, think it's their data because they've invested in the technical platform or the clinical trial. Well, patients actually expect this is their data, and they expect, if we just look at research, that researchers make best use of that to learn as much as they can to actually advance science and advance patient care. But what very often happens is that data ends on brick walls of hospitals, or ends because there has been no data protection strategy from the start. And very often also because of vested interests, GDPR and data protection is being used as an excuse for actually a meaningful use of that data for the best interest of patients, which is advancing care for that patient, as well as advancing research and knowledge about the disease and treatments as such and the interventions. So we're not expecting anyone to own our data. And I think the data protection law GDPR has said very straight that the patient is the ultimate owner of his or her own data, and it's not somebody who runs a technical platform. So I think this is important. If we just move to the next one, we have, of course, thought about guiding principles around that. And that probably reflects a bit of those expectations that the patient community has. We've called it the 5 I's. The 5 I's because there are 5 I's in these different points, which I'm going through bit by bit. So first of all, interests. We need to acknowledge it's not just industry, or it's not just the payers, or not just patients who have interests. Everybody in healthcare has interests, and because it's very data driven, of course, data is at the core of interests of everyone. And we need to make sure that whenever we generate data, they're not just serving interests of the different stakeholders, they're in the end ultimately serving the interests of those that have provided it, which is the patient. Then second one is investment. It's not who pays decides. So just because you've set up an app or a clinical trial doesn't mean it's your data. So the one who provides the funding should not decide actually who uses the data, who sets the research questions, who decides on the methodology of analytics, or who selects the patient population. It needs to be created together with the patient community. And of course, the patient community doesn't have money to invest. So we need to make sure that money doesn't rule the game. Third one, involvement. It's very important that any stakeholder involvement should take place with the objective of understanding what the patient's needs are, what their wants are, what the patient preferences are, and what the fears and concerns are. So involvement should clarify that. The involvement is not there just to serve stakeholders' interests. It's actually to think about How do we best understand what the patients want, and then use a digital service to deliver to that? And then finally, implementation. It's very important to think when we think about frameworks, methodologies, populations, platforms, tools, and so on. It's very important to think about that together with the patient community from the start, because otherwise it might just be biased by the party that sets up such a platform. So involvement in the implementation is a high expectation in the patient community. And then finally, we're all driven for impact. So whatever we do with data, we need to think that the intelligence gaps that we have, the data that we're trying to use to fill them, should actually help to reach informed decisions about what the patients really want. On one hand, it needs to inform the stakeholders, and on the other hand, and that's very often forgotten in digital services, that the artificial intelligence and decision support tools are not meant just to empower the physician. They need to inform the patient in their own interest, in their own decisions. If we want to move towards shared decision, it doesn't help if we just have a physician interface in those platforms, but we need a patient interface too. So think about these 5 I's when you think later on about stakeholder expectations. And in my last slide, I just want to raise one point. What's the role of patient organizations in all that? Probably the patient organizations are the honest brokers in that game, because our genuine interest is not to, let's say, be empowered. Our genuine interest is to really do what our patients in our community generally wants. And that's why patient organizations today, and that's very different to 10 years ago, are in a very different position. The patient organizations can actually run data cooperatives. They can think about federated data. They can help to generate, collect, and share pseudonymized data, and they can actually make sure that there's fair use by everyone, academia, pharma, healthcare institutions, that they can derive their own intelligence from the data that is being collected from our patients. And they can be kind of also a watchdog to ensure lawful use of data, consent management of those that provide their data, processes about withdrawal of consent, and also to make sure that the data, any outcomes and any findings are published not only if they're positive, but also that negative data is being published. So you can see in that model, which I have nicked from Ernst Haven from ETH Zurich, we see patient organizations as a central point probably for data commons. And we have these discussions in big data projects like Harmony, who actually governs the data. Patient organizations can have a role there to be the mediator, the fiduciary, the trusted party, the honest broker, or whatever, between regulators, payers, policymakers, clinical researchers, healthcare providers, and industry. And with that, I'm handing back to Elizabeth, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Jan. Really great to start off with the patient perspective. I'm going to hand it over to the panel and see if anyone has any direct reactions or questions for Jan.
Maybe if I can start, Jan, so patient engagement in digital health is, I think, still in the early days, but you have been on the front line of patient engagement for much more than that. And so if you compare to your past experience and to on your finishing points about the role of patient organization, where do you feel we are starting from compared to your past experience? Is it the same process that we have to go through again? What can we learn from the past, and what is different in digital health?
Well, I think in digital, we are quite similar to where we were 10 years ago in patient engagement, in the respect of that the process of engagement were quite at the start, let's say at that time, patients were participating in clinical studies, and today patients are participating as beta testers of apps. So it's a very similar starting point of being more or less observers and subject of digital medicine, but not really being partners on equal eye level. But there are two things that have changed, and I think that will change the pace on which we will implement patient engagement. First one is that we have established models of citizen science. We have established process of patient engagement. And we could build a lot on what like PFMD and others have done in medicines development. and think about how these processes actually apply to digital health. And the other thing that is totally different today, I mean, 10 years ago, our community was in infancy. We were largely active on the patient support level, peer-to-peer support, but we were not grown-up organizations that have people that understand data and science. And I think that's very different because we can be partners today. We have the training through UPADI, through PFMD, through other sources, through WeCan, and we can actually engage as partners in the digital space. While 10 years ago, we would have been not in the right position with the right knowledge to do that. I don't know if that responds to your question, Nicola.
Oh, perfect, and good to see that we are now better equipped to actually embrace digital health with the patient community. Good to see.
Yeah, and I have a question. Hi, thank you for that presentation, and I agree 100% with everything you said. When will this happen? When will we get the this graph that you have in front of us, the Zurich model? Can we expect it today?
Well, I think in some diseases it's already happening. If you look at Duchenne, if you look at some rare diseases, if you look, especially in rare diseases, the patient community is taking leadership because nobody else felt really like they're in the position of running research or collecting their own data or running their own registries. So we can see that happening in some diseases. And I think that's why it's important that we address this with PFMD and stakeholder expectations, because it's the same question we had 10 years ago in medicines development. It's happening vertically in single diseases, but it's not happening systematically, and we don't have the process and the framework for it. And I think that can happen today. But to respond to your question, Ray, I think in some disease areas, we can exactly look at the models because they've established it.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Jan. Jan, there are quite a few really great questions coming in through the chat. I'd also like to direct you there, and then we can continue this conversation as we go through the engagement exercise later on during this session. But for the sake of time, I am going to transition over to Ray for now. So Ray, over to you. If you could introduce yourself and then give us your perspective.
Sure. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So my name is Ray Pinto. I'm the Director of Digital Transformation Policy in Digital Europe. If we go to the next slide. Digital Europe, we're a trade association. We represent 40 national trade associations across Europe. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the EU. And we also have, more recently, we are a 20-year organization primarily representing the tech sector, so all those companies on the right. But in the past 3-4 years, we've had and invited many of the different stakeholders in the health sector to join us as well. And as I understand, we have quite a diverse community. Many of the trade associations are usually medical devices or pharmaceuticals. We have them all, as you can see on the left. And that has led to many interesting discussions. Many discussions that we realize we have more questions than answers. There is a lot that this community needs to learn about, both how to use these technologies in a thoughtful and right way. What are the goals and objectives, and where and how can we move forward across working with many of the governments that I would say is looking to try to solve at least Europe's most difficult questions in addressing rare diseases or creating vaccines or tackling pandemics across the EU member states. And it's not easy, and it's something that clearly the European Commission is now embarked on something that's quite ambitious in sharing health data across the EU and within each EU member state. And then, us ourselves, what is our role in regards to maybe creating a European health data space in Europe? So if we go to the next slide. We have tried over the past year or so to answer, I think, two very important questions. The first important question is, and it goes back to what Nicola and Jan have been saying, is our industry needs to take ownership, right? We don't own patients' data. How can we, use the data? How can we take, ownership and responsibility? And that for us is kind of the fundamental question in answering, how or what is trust that is needed for digital health. And I think when it comes to patients, that is the primary question that we need to answer, is earning that trust and explaining transparently, how data is being used and how we're helping other stakeholders, such as patient groups, in their journey. And then another area that we've been looking at is what can we as a joint industry, both health sector and tech sector, when we come together, what kind of innovations can we see that will, be focused on the patient? It'll be patient-centric, it'll be patient empowering. And what is that? And, what does Europe need to do to accelerate and deploy that so we are delivering important, results across the whole, patient continuum? Next slide. When we, start examining this more and more, and we have our member Accenture, clearly it's not an easy thing to solve. There are a lot of questions that patient groups are asking, particularly in the use of digital technologies. They want to know how they can get the information better on their health, right? What recommended actions can they get? Who are their trusted suppliers of that, advice? Is there doctors? Is it pharma? Is it, a software or app? What kind of quality can they expect? And, a question of nothing would make me more likely to even use digital. So there is clearly not a blanket statement, and it would be very wrong. And I'd be very surprised. I think it'd be highly misinformed if anyone in my community would say, we have all the answers, buy just digital, throw it into the healthcare systems, it'll solve all the problems. That may have been, something that was said 20, 15 years ago. If it's being said today, then it shouldn't be. Clearly, we have to, work with the patient groups, we have to work with the healthcare professionals, and we have to, design these and better understand how these things are used. And it can be used in, in a value set way, so people's trust, is not being betrayed. It only takes a few instances, particularly in the advent of emerging technologies such as AI, where something goes wrong and you lose confidence. And when you lose confidence, you lose the momentum of the adoption and scale that these technologies really need, to be able to deliver any kind of sizable events. There are a multitude of technologies, pilot projects, examples that are showing, some important results. But there are some clear obstacles in these technologies reaching scale, where they can deliver on a large, scale to patients in Europe. Next. So when, we want to build that trust framework together, and some countries in Europe have done a tremendous job in answering it, primarily the Nordic ones, but, they start looking at, these questions about data and data governance, right? When you look at the GDPR, which is an important regulation, I should say, Article 1.3 of the regulation communicates its main purpose, which was to ensure that Europeans and citizens would be able to share sensitive and personal information across the EU. And Article 1.3 says that sensitive information from European citizens cannot be restricted by a member state. Unfortunately, due to the negotiations and the formation and the co-decision-making process of the EU, health was removed. Health was seen as a member state competence and not something that the EU should be meddling into. And that has created massive fragmentation. Just trying to get your medical file across a member state. I'm a French citizen. I cannot get my medical records into Belgium, and we share a border. I cannot share it if I had a disease, to an expert doctor in another country. Not possible. During the vaccine development, very little vaccine research was happening in Europe. It was happening in member states, possibly, but could not be sharing data sets across the EU. And there were examples of hundreds of vaccine trials that were happening, and the data, less than 1% was actually able to go back to the researchers because of these very difficult legislative laws and fragmented rules in each of the different member states. And some of them, when you look at Germany, you have these rules in each Länder, where you have 16 different Länders, or 13 different regions in Italy. So trying to address this is something that the EU is trying to embark on. It's created a data act, looking at a model that exists in Finland, where they have actually created a way for health data to be processed in a safe way with consent from the patient, with transparency to the GDPR, and used for research. This model is now trying to be rolled across the whole EU in a European health data space regulation. And it's going to be very difficult, I think, because to get an agreement from member state to member state is not an easy thing. It's often a very difficult thing. But here are the questions, that we were asking ourselves in the formation of those two documents. I do encourage people to read those documents. I'd love to hear feedback on what you think, because we are learning. We don't have the answers, and we'd like to also know and update that document as well as we learn. Let's go to the next slide. We see trust in really 4 areas, and when you look at how trust is being looked at, you obviously need to demonstrate those benefits, and there is a clear role where that can be done. For example, unfortunately, with the conflict in Ukraine, we've seen a rise of increase of cyber attacks on hospitals, primarily in Eastern Europe, and the ability to share information and for cybersecurity experts to be able to engage, it's not there yet. And in fact, it is impossible for data to be shared or intelligence across the EU at the moment. Hopefully that will change, where you can address and then protect other hospitals across the whole EU. And of course, this is patient data, it's patient information. These are hospital services keeping patients alive that are being shut down by the Russian cyber attacks. So industry can play a role in that. Industry can play a role in cleansing the data that is, improving the quality that's being used, for AI. There are different ways in which, industry can be helping the various different, communities, and also to promote, literacy and awareness, the risks involved and the benefits of using these different technologies, and of course backing public-private collaborations. I'm going to go next slide, please. I'm sorry if I'm just going through these really fast. I want to leave time for the other panels, of course. When we look at our second paper about innovation, the important thing that we learned is that a lot of the innovation where it's happening across the world, of course, may work, move way faster in the US because they do not have very stringent fragmentations between their federal, their states, but a lot of it is very much data driven. And we have seen that, population of health management is something that has potential in developing. That's to ensure patients are getting, the highest level of care. There is, digital twin technologies so that you can imitate in a virtual world, a human heart organ before an operation to ensure the access and boost the success rate as well for drug use in clinical trials. There's the advancement, in genomics and patient-centered medicine. There is one of our members, Intel, their senior vice president has, or had, I should say, advanced cancer. And by being able to map out his whole DNA, was able to apply precision medicine and drug application, and his cancer has gone to remission. So, these are things that, the technologies can do, and the AI, can drive. What it needs, though, is data. Data is the fundamental core ingredient for, these algorithms to learn. And it's very difficult when you look in Europe, where the data, for example, in a country like Denmark, I'm just picking Denmark because it's a small country. It has 4 million people, primarily very homogeneous, biomarkers, and the algorithms are quite limited. So people really have to, if you want to develop AI algorithms, then you have to jump, to a larger market like the United States, where you have massive data sets and you can train your AI to deliver valuable services. I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to stop because I'm getting the signal that I've gone over, so I'm going to stop. Just going to leave you with this about, some KPIs and what we think that where the EU can achieve by 2030. I think all of these things are on track. There is clear commitment by the EU governments and the EU. If we get there, we will see. But let's just say we're cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. Really appreciate your point of view here from a broad range, as you mentioned, of organizations that all feed into Digital Europe. And we are going to pick back up more. I know that there's a lot of great questions coming in on the chat. You mentioned 2 papers. We would love also to have those resources shared with the audience for their future reference as well. I'm going to transition directly to Robin, though, for the sake of time, and then we can go out and pick back up any questions for Ray once we move into the next section. So Robin, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robin Bent. I'm the Director of Patient-Focused Drug Development at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And I really looking forward to talking with you today about data, and more importantly, data sharing. And so we've been talking a lot about the importance of data sharing within FDA, and we believe that it's really a critical piece in moving drug development forward. This is true kind of across drug development, but it's particularly true when we talk about rare disease drug development. And there are really 2 types of data that I want to talk a little bit about, because both are important, but they play kind of different roles in the development process. And the first is really that qualitative data. Patient-focused drug development and the movement to include the voice of the patient throughout the drug development process has really led to an increase in this qualitative work. And so this is when drug developers meet with patients to really understand what matters to them, what they see as the biggest burdens on their condition, the things that bother them most, etc. And this information is really important because we know from our patient-focused drug development meetings that we've had at FDA and through multiple discussions with patients and patient organizations that the endpoints that are being measured in clinical trials aren't always the endpoints that matter to patients. We also learn through these interviews, we also learn a lot about benefit risk trade-offs that patients are willing to make in order to have access to treatment. And we now see that medical product developers are increasingly on board with the idea of talking to patients and understanding their conditions and what they're looking for in an effective treatment for their condition. And so, but now we're hearing from patients, particularly patients with rare conditions, that they're being asked or being approached by multiple medical product developers and being asked the same questions kind of over and over again. And this is because the information gained from these patient interviews tends to be locked behind closed doors in order to inform a single drug development program, perhaps, instead of being shared. And I think that we really have been thinking about how people can kind of help address this problem, right? And I think one of the things that we're really thinking about, especially for this qualitative data, is the importance of publication, publishing these publishing the data in these peer-reviewed journals and things like that. And of course, like maybe this doesn't happen immediately because I think there's a place for publication that can be done in a way and in a timeline that allows for decreased burden to patients so they don't keep having to answer the same questions repeatedly, but also doesn't disadvantage the company that did the work. Another type of data sharing that I want to talk about is the sharing of individual patient level data. And this data is really critical to move drug development forward. FDA has a cooperative agreement with the Critical Path Institute to help facilitate this data sharing. We funded the development of the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics platform. This platform and other platforms like it promote the sharing of existing patient level data and encourage the standardization of new data collection. These platforms can receive and protect data from a variety of sources, such as natural history studies, clinical trial data, and they can really inform the rare disease or any disease characterization, clinical trial design, and other critical questions in rare disease drug development. The platform provides a resource through which authorized users like disease researchers and drug developers can access this patient level data for a particular condition, which then can be analyzed to better understand disease progression and disease heterogeneity across affected patient populations. This in turn can also kind of inform trial design, the selection of endpoints, and other important considerations. Also, by pooling data from many different patients across different rare diseases or different diseases, researchers are able to examine similarities within and kind of across the diseases and gain insight that could be impossible from individuals in isolation or small populations. So you can see there's really a great deal to be gained kind of from the data sharing. And of course, all of this is critical, but there are some challenges here as well, right? And I think we've heard a little bit about that today. In the scenario of the platform, in our scenario, the platform is free to end users because it's really currently being funded by FDA, but realistically, data sharing costs money. Whether it is cleaning the data or standardizing it or just hosting the data in a manner that is friendly to end users, there's a cost. And then of course, there's the cost of protecting the data, which I mean is critical because we really need to be sure that we're doing things right because people need to trust that data sharing is being done in an ethical manner. Particularly when we're talking about individual data, we want to ensure that it's secure, that it's de-identified, and that patients have consented to the sharing of the data. But as we heard from Jan, many people want their data shared. We hear from a lot of patients that they would like their data to live beyond kind of just a single trial, right? They want it to continue to be impactful. But of course, it needs to be impactful in a secure way that people are comfortable with and that protects privacy. And so I'm just going to mention some of the challenges that we've heard about, mostly from patient groups, but also from others. We've heard about from patient groups who'd like their trial data to be shared or their data to be shared, but they don't own the data, and the company or the investigator that does isn't really open to sharing that data. We've heard from people who would like to share data, but the informed consent document that was used in the trial didn't allow for such sharing, or perhaps the informed consent allowed for sharing, but only for sharing by nonprofits or academia. And I get that because when I think of for-profit companies, I think of kind of data aggregators who are going to sell the data to the highest bidder or perhaps even all of the bidders and make a huge profit while the patients kind of get nothing. But the reality is that most drug companies are for-profit, or medical product developers are for-profit, and they're where we see a lot of the advancement in understanding and treating diseases coming from. So by limiting the sharing of the data, we're potentially denying access to the people who are, some of the people who are likely to use it to advance drug development. We've also heard that data sharing can be challenging for academic researchers who build their research program on the information they obtain, and this is kind of how they compete for grants. And so we need to find a way to allow for data sharing in a manner that doesn't disadvantage the researchers who are dedicated to finding treatments for really challenging conditions that cause so much health suffering. But we also need to be able to compete for grants to fund their research. And so I think there are are a lot of opportunities here. And we're seeing companies partnering with patient groups in a way to get both quality input into their development plans, but also access to patient registries for recruitment. And we're really encouraging patient groups to kind of understand their power in this partnership and try to get kind of this prospective agreement that at the completion of the study, or once the study publishes or a medical product is approved, the data that's been collected can be shared. And so I guess, like, in closing, I think we really need to work together to find solutions. We need to have the difficult conversations about how to promote data sharing without ignoring the reality that data sharing can have costs to people who are collecting the data. And I think that this really kind of takes a village, which is why I'm excited to see efforts such as this, where we have multiple people from diverse backgrounds at the table thinking of ways to move the science forward. So thanks.
Thanks, Robin. I'm seeing Ray, Jan, you guys look eager to ask a question. So I'm
Terrifying. Okay.
pass it over to you if there's any reactions there on the patient or industry perspective side.
I was actually replying to Jan's question to me, but Robin, maybe I can rehash the question I asked you in the preparation. You know, here in the EU, we're trying to create this e-health data space, and that may take 10 years, by the way. But you know, how can we cooperate better with you in the US in sharing data, and you know, what would be your advice to EU officials?
Wow, I don't know that I have the technological expertise to really be able to provide advice to officials, but I think, you know, I think that it's really important that we kind of work together to find a way to try and encourage the sharing, because none of us benefits from these silos, right? I mean, I think there needs to be some way to move these forward. And I know that one of the things that we've done, one of the ways that we're kind of trying to work on it with that the Critical Path Institute is trying to work on this, is that we have kind of servers in Europe so that that allows us to kind of aggregate data from both the US and Europe onto these platforms and still kind of remain within the regulations. Don't know if that completely answered the question, but sorry.
Maybe just to build on that, because we also very often give the feeling that we have a model of sharing in Europe, or we are building a model of sharing in Europe, which is moving quite fast and advanced. And I think some of the best practices are also in the US, and I have in mind the Genetic Alliance. And that's one of the very few efforts I'm aware of where there is a kind of scaling of data generation and data sharing. And so that's one of the models worth exploring further moving forward, because it's a cooperative model. And so far, I have been quite impressed by what I have seen there. So just wanted to also say that there are champions of data sharing, patient-led data sharing in the US too. Just wanted to mention that.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I did a huge disservice when I started talking about the platform, mentioning the Critical Path Initiative, but not mentioning the NORD, because NORD is a key partner in the effort as well. And of course, there's so many other patient groups that are key to this, to the success of this as well. So thanks for mentioning that.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you, Nicola, for those questions. We will continue this conversation, as I mentioned, when we start engaging with the audience. But I think now is a good time to transition to Gus Deyes. If you could please introduce yourself, Gus Deyes, and kind of tie this and reflect back on the speakers. I think you have a very unique and great perspective, being a part of the EPF, an organizer of the Patient Engagement Open Forum, as well as Data Saves Lives.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So hi, my name is Gus Deyes. I work for European Patients Forum, and I'm also the coordinator of Data Saves Lives initiative. So I will make it very short. Actually, I will not take too much of the time because I've been listening to the speakers, and there are very key highlights that come out, and very cross-cutting actually messages coming out. What I understand is when individual stakeholders work in their own spaces, there are very few questions. Everything flows. But when it comes to making multi-stakeholder engagements in the health data and digital health topics, that's where the questions and the challenges are starting, because we don't know first patient organizations or patients, they don't know sometimes what that means. Even to a level to be able to get engaged, they will have to understand the concept. So I saw a lot in the chat as well, mentioning about the health data and digital health literacy. It's not even only about the individual and independent health data literacy or digital health literacy within the context of multi-stakeholder engagement literacy, because there are different terminologies used, different concepts being shared, and if these are not grasped by the patient communities, they will not be able to give the valuable input or get engaged, because they have their knowledge about their disease areas, what they need, what they're suffering from, or what is expected from them is something they don't know, and what is being asked sometimes is something they don't know. And another thing I see a lot as well, for example, I see there are a lot of platforms out there that they can be used for their sharing their health data. So how to do that is a question patient organizations or patients, individuals will need to know where to go, who to talk to. This is one of those things when it comes to multi-stakeholder engagement, and who is in charge, like initially Nicola was mentioning, who is taking the responsibility on which work. So to make it in general aspects, there are so many questions when it comes to the engagement with the multi-stakeholder in the digital health and health data initiatives. As Data Saves Lives, for example, we're really trying to bring on board this digital health and health data, mainly literacy questions, so concepts, to at least start from scratch in a way, and bring the communities together to openly discuss, ask the questions, these how, what, where, when, who questions, to start from somewhere. Because like Jan said, there are certain communities that are so advanced in this within Europe, but some communities are not. And their voices are also quite valuable when it comes to the big data discussions. Health data space, European health data space is going to be inclusive of all the nations. That's the plan. So in that sense, we really need to bring on board the health literacy, the data literacy. So health data, digital literacy on board. I keep on repeating myself. So from what we are trying with Data Saves Lives is also trying to make this granular, not to discuss about one big title, saying health data discussion or digital health discussion, but just break it down to smaller discussions, bite-sized discussions, and take it from there. And that's what we've been trying. And I see that actually from the speakers today, there is a need, but there is a channeling need as well to be able to start from somewhere and start discussing it bit by bit, not just discussing high level, because then we do not go to the operational part of the things. How do we do this? So I won't take more time. I guess we have a lot as well following the discussion. So that will be it from my side. And I think it'd be very nice to hear as well the participants' points of views. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Gus Deyes. So that's actually the perfect transition for us to move into our co-creation exercise. So Diana, I'm going to ask you to bring back the slides. Thank you very much. So feeding into the conversation today, we are going to start looking at asking you, who are the right stakeholders that we should be talking to related to patient engagement in digital health and digital health data? What questions should we be asking them? And then lastly, we're going to ask you to provide your expectations as far as what you're expecting from the different stakeholders. So from industry, from digital organizations, from regulatory. And during this point, we'll be continuing the discussions, continuing the Q&A with our great panelists that have spoken already today. We will be sharing a group map link in the chat. We'll be using a tool that we call Group Map. And through this, you can add in your information, we can upvote, we can vote. It's a great tool. And we will also be keeping this open after the session in order to continue gathering your input and feedback. You can share this with others that were not able to attend the session, because what we are going to do is the information that you provide us is going to directly shape who we talk to and the content of the interviews that we undertake for the stakeholder expectations matrix. So if we can go ahead and bring up the group map. And the way this works is you'll have to click that link that's here in the chat. Exactly. It's easier. You have to bring up a separate browser. So we're showing you here what it looks like. We'll give everyone an opportunity to get on board. But you will join here. And then the very first question that we're going to go through today is just what stakeholder group do you represent? So this will kind of enable us to understand a little bit of the priorities from each of the stakeholder groups. So Diana, if you can just click the view results so we can start seeing everyone coming in. And we have, it looks like a little over 100 participants on the call with us today. So continue to give everyone another opportunity to join. And it looks like we have majority patients with us, as well as researchers and pharmaceutical companies or industry. Great to see the turnout from researchers as well. Really excited to have you all here helping us. Great, looks like 47 people on the group map and counting. All right. So then we'll continue to leave this open as you join. Feel free to start here to fill out what your stakeholder group is. As we mentioned, this provides a lot of insight as we move forward. And if you're an other, feel free to write in the chat who you represent. I think it's also really important. I know we've added quite a few stakeholder groups to this exercise for the open forum because we've gotten that feedback in the chat from those who represent the other categories. So feel free to write that in the chat and let us know who you are. And then we will go ahead and move forward to our first group map question of the day, which is what stakeholder should we be talking to? So we have already outlined a couple stakeholder group examples, industry, healthcare professionals, but then you can see we also have this box here in the bottom, other stakeholders. Please feel free to write in who you think we should be talking to and upvote any existing entry if you feel like that's important. We will be prioritizing who we talk to based off of the votes that we received today. So while I'm going to give everyone quite a few minutes to go through this, we can pick back up a little bit on some of the questions that were addressed in the chat earlier. I would like to start off with potentially a question here for Gus Deyes. Gus Deyes.
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful, thank you. So one of the things that came through in the chat was that there's just a lot of information and data to sort through. Someone made that comment that while it seems like there's a need for digital health literacy building, for resources, for trainings, that there's just so much data to sort through. How do we do it? And I know that that's something that you're looking at through Data Saves Lives. So I wonder if you could provide any kind of insight into the plethora of options and data there is related to the patient engagement in digital space, and how you go through addressing that with Data Saves Lives.
So one thing to just say that we do not directly work with the data itself. We're really working with the concepts of data, health data. So it's our job is more to, just solve the matrix question of 1Os and kind of try and make the patient communities understand the concepts around the topic. But we know very well there are certain standardization methods, for example, when it comes to health data, like we are working separately at EPF with EU project. Eden, for example, is one good example where they're using OMOB, it's a standard data model to be able to do the standardization of the data, so that, because we know if data is not actually cleaned up and standardized, it's not really useful. And even the idea of that, this concept is something we are communicating to our communities, so they understand that there is big data, a lot of data out there, but we know for sure that it's not been well organized and well structured to be actually useful. And we're talking about the real world data, for example, that turning into a real world evidence. You would really need to work on the data.
Thank you, Gus. When I think also in relation to just how much data there is to sort through, there are a lot of also resources to deal with that data, correct?
Yes, totally. And that's the thing. There's so many places that the data is collected, and the concepts grow the more places that the data is channeled from. It's very important as well to mention the source of the data, where it has been developed and where it leads to and where it ends and what its impact is. So the reverse mechanism of feeding what happened with the data, so the impact and the value of it to the person that actually shared it. So it's a very complex, we all know it's much more detailed than just saying sharing the health data or, gathering the data somewhere and using it for benefits of medicine in the future. Yeah.
Speaking with the different types of data that exist, I know, Jan, this concept of data ownership is something that you've brought up, and we've heard a lot today from Ray, from Robin, from you, Jan, as well. I'd like to maybe dig a little bit deeper into this, where you said that the data doesn't necessarily belong to those who fund it. But then maybe you can dig a little bit more into what are the expectations that you have around that, and what you do mean when you say data ownership.
Well, I think one of the questions is who hosts the data technically and who has access to that. And I think we need to differentiate those roles because they're often being seen as one. And I mean, what we're struggling with at the moment is defining like business models for those that run the platform. So is it paper analytics? Is it a usage fee? Is it a grant-based system and trying to get money from philanthropic organizations or whatever? So how is such a platform funded, and how is the data being governed? And I really think we need to differentiate between these two roles, because otherwise these platforms will not be sustainable. We're having a lot of discussions in like IMI Harmony at the moment about how would a big data platform like that move forward afterwards, and it's not so easy. And probably we need to have that conversation also with policymakers, is how is that kind of data infrastructure being funded, that we decouple funding of those who gather data from those who run such a platform to allow research. My response is a bit blurry because I don't have a response, but that's exactly what we need to work on, that these kind of platforms really emerge and are sustainable in the long run.
I see. Yes. Does anyone want to build on Jan's comment? Jan, I feel like you gave a great question there that potentially can feed into our stakeholder expectations matrix for regulators. So does anyone want to build on that point even more?
So I think it was really great for me to hear Jan's presentation, because I feel like inherently I agree with personally I agree with a lot of the things that that he said. I think it's really important to kind of consider this. I think sustainability is really key, because the last thing you want is to have these platforms built and have them kind of, you know, not be sustainable. I think we want them to, in some ways, kind of try to be interoperable to the extent that they can be, so that we don't have a whole bunch of new silos, right? Like the whole idea of data sharing is that we're breaking down the silos, but if we're creating like 87 trillion new platforms, like what does that look like? And are those just like the newest kind of most updated silos? And which of course we would like to avoid, right? I mean, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of what we're hoping for. But I think data ownership is really, I mean, individual level data ownership versus kind of like data sets and things like that are really, it's a really interesting conversation. I think it really requires a lot of stakeholders at the table, because I mean, honestly, we need to come up with ideas and plans that are, you know, are sustainable for everybody, and kind of ignoring some of the challenges is kind of at our peril, right? I mean, some of them are going to be difficult conversations to have, but I don't really know that we can move things forward without having those difficult conversations about when is appropriate for time for data sharing, when, like, what data should be shared, what data, you know, maybe it's too early to be shared, and things like that.
I think maybe one aspect too, which is important, is that today the reason why while data is one of the has a lot of value, we are also discussing today that we are not sure about sustainability of such platforms. And I think that's because there are shortcuts today by other type of organizations that are not respecting the needs that we are highlighting today. And I think it's really important that not only we develop the right models, but we also start to condemn the wrong models. And that's really important that we get out there with that, because as long as you have these shortcuts and that we offer these options, it's easier, and that makes the life of the groups that want to develop the right models much more difficult too. So I think it's really important that we start to build on the legislations, on the principles, you know, all the content from Data Save Lives, the models for data. I think it's really important not only to think about what's right, but also stop what's wrong. And I think we need to build on that in the next few months and few years.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nicola. I think that's a good point for us to transition and start looking at the questions. So we've kind of finished up this, who should we be talking to? Looks like patient organizations are high up on the list, along with government's digital representatives. So those are the two highest voted stakeholder profiles. And now moving into our second map, where now that we have a better understanding of who we should be talking to, let's go through what we should be asking them in order to ensure that we are asking the right questions and trying to dig to the root of the issues that we're trying to address. So feel free, I'm just going to speak to the audience here for a second. Feel free to go through. We have the same categories as we had previously. Feel free to add in some questions and upvote any of the ones that you feel are very relevant to you. Then I see a comment coming here in the chat from Tom. Hi, Tom. Nice to see you here again. So absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why we bring up ownership, and to Robin's point, that these are the difficult conversations that we need to have in order to face and try to solve the issue together. One of the things that we have, that Ray, you kind of pointed to in your conversation, in your presentation, was on trust. And so here Tom is bringing up the aspect of privacy. So privacy isn't something that we've necessarily touched on. How does privacy factor into your expectations and Digital Europe's agenda for this year as well?
Well, how do you define privacy, right? So if we look more at data protection, then as I said earlier, the GDPR, GDPR is a very technical legal document, right? The GDPR says that you as a patient, you control your data, but no one owns the data. The GDPR is very explicit about that. Data is data, no one owns it, and you can control it, but there are ways of how that's used, the transparency, the consent measures, where that's stored, and there's going to be a whole bunch of other regulations now on getting all that data into being able to be shared for research purposes. Now, the very sad news is, I wish I could tell you that what the EU is embarking on is a giant data lake of 500 million, citizens. So we'll easily outpace Robin and the Americans and create a massive, data set. And guess what's going to be in that data set? The cure to cancer, the cure to every disease, the solution to any vaccine. That's what's in there, because you'll never find a more diverse biomarker population than the EU. But that's not going to happen. There is not going to be one data pool that will be created. There'll be some visualization of health information that will be shared. You can only see it. You can't edit it. You can't touch it. There'll be some instances in some specific pilots where maybe some research can happen. And none of that's going to happen until maybe 2030. So we're not going in a direction where we can solve the cancer that Jan is experiencing, or the other diseases that have to be addressed. And that's the very sad truth, because there's going to be models that are preventing the data to be released from the hospital systems, or my physician who's based in here across the street in Brussels. Not to mention, I grew up in France and Canada. That data is locked away and siloed into their computers, and I do not have access to it. Even though the GDPR says I control it, well, not for Canada, but I control the data in France, I can't see it. So these are the very specific areas. But when it comes to the GDPR, okay, people may criticize it, and it's not the best, but it is the best data protection regulation humans have created ever. So we need to build on that, and we need to make sure that some of the flaws in it, as I stated earlier, in where each member state can create their own separate rules, that has created the massive fragmentation, is resolved. And I was trying to put in under regulators, I didn't get too many votes, but try to get the data protection authorities. They're the people that can solve it. So let's say, for example, Elizabeth, that you've given me your health records, right? And we do a vaccine, and we know this vaccine will kill you. But I cannot, de-identify that. It's against the law to inform you you're going to die if you take that vaccine. So this is, something that the data protection authorities, need to solve and to resolve quickly. Anonymization, pseudonymization, there is no clarity. And as I stated earlier, data cannot move over EU borders, even when they were trying to create the COVID vaccine. So, these are things that will have to be resolved, but it's going to take, why can I not use the example of the vaccine? Sabine, I think it's very relevant.
No, it's just because I think just because of the whole everybody got vaccinated recently, so you are creating some fear. So
I'm not creating a fear. These are facts, right? So we have to.
It's a joke. It's a joke. I think Sabine is doing.
Well, we have to address and move the data over. And we've talked to hospital groups who accumulate millions of data points, sometimes a day, but they can't use it. They can't exploit it. And the reason is, what's the business model for them? There isn't one. And they're completely right? You know, why should they be spending money and resources when there is no incentive or business model for them to do so? So I think these are the kind of things that have to be addressed that are not easy. They're really not easy. But hopefully in 10 years, we'll, you know, be able to answer some of these questions. It's our very long, you know, answer, but.
I just want to probably also get back to the privacy thing, because we need to always remember, why are patients concerned about data privacy and misuse of data? And there was quite a telling survey that Eurodis did and published in 2019 from the Rare Barometer survey, which they conducted with over 2,000 rare disease patients in over 66 countries. And they were actually looking at the reasons and concerns around sharing data. And what became very clear, that 95% of respondents said they would be ready to share their data also on research outside of their own disease space, if that improves the well-being of rare disease patients outside of their own condition. So there was a huge consent by patients, but what they actually said in that survey also, that about 50% were really concerned about the use of their data in a different context from the one. And I can just share an anecdote. I mean, I've been a cancer patient for 20 years. And when I was actually offered statutory insurance by my employer, which usually goes without health checks, I was the employee that was asked about the health testimony. And it came out from internal investigations that the insurance had an internal database which had people at risk in their database. And because I had cancer and because it was a large company, they actually connected the dots, even though I didn't talk publicly about my cancer. This is what patients are really concerned about, that use of their data and their condition and so on outside of their context and being the victim of discrimination and these kind of things are so important. That's why also patients push for the right to be forgotten on the European level at the moment, to make an end to their condition once they are out. But I think there's a huge consent about sharing data, and that's why we need to have a more differentiated view on privacy for what and to protect against what. And I think that's very important. And that probably is, again, a topic for the expectation matrix, to think about what kind of privacy are we expecting as patients.
And can I ask you, Jan, because right to be forgotten is entrenched in the GDPR. So what is the problem? Is it that the enforcement is not moving fast enough?
Yeah, I think so. The adoption is different from member state to member state, and some have adopted laws like that. I mean, look at me. I've been on treatment for 13 years. I've been out of treatment for 7 years. Still, I can't get many insurances and whatever, because I need to disclose that I'm a cancer patient, or I have been. And there needs to be a certain point in time where this is forgotten and nobody can actually refer to that I've had cancer 20 years ago. And in some countries, this is illegal. In some countries like Germany, this is still not. So that's why adoption different based on member states is different.
And for me, just to, because you were discussing, you were talking about the lack of incentive from business model point of view, but I think, and with the example of the vaccines that you gave, sorry Sabine for coming back to that. With the example you gave, of course, the patient would be totally open to share the data for that purpose. It's for the other type of use and the insurances or the banks that there is a problem. But for me, that indeed there is no incentive, because it's not close to their purpose either as an organization. And that's where the role of a patient organization, I will not talk about a business model, but certainly about the value model of a patient organization, stewardship of the data, making some decisions on behalf of the patients, and because the patients have accepted that. And I think that's really that's something that has been ignored so far, the role of patient organization. And I've seen earlier in the chat all the question about capability and capacity to deal with that. And indeed, we have a lot to work with this. But I remember Jan mentioned 2 cases of, and one of them was patients like me, and I was quite close to this one. But as a commercial entity, whatever is written on the website. Go on the Patients Like Me website and see what they say about what they will do to the user, how they will inform the user. But in the space of a couple of months, they were in China and they were in health insurances and all the data with it. And thus a commercial entity has really no mean to guarantee that it will not be the case. Who it will be sold to, a commercial entity doesn't know it. And so I think that's what I think. I've been thinking a lot about that. I think the only type of entity that can ensure a long-term trustworthy data management and stewardship would be the patient organization in my mind. And there is still a work to do, even if we go there. I totally agree with that, but that's probably the only organization in position to do so. And I stop here.
I think this is a really good segue, Robin. When we were prepping for this session, you said something really interesting also about what commercial activities and for commercial purposes can mean, and how this maybe has a connotation which we don't always understand as general citizens.
Yeah, so I mean, I can only speak for myself, and you know, I've been at FDA for about 3 years after being at NIH for much longer, and I'll say that, you know, when I see consent forms and it talks about, you know, consent for my data to be shared with nonprofits versus like consent for my data to be shared with for-profit, I always kind of think of for-profit as what we're talking about, right? Like the insurance companies or data aggregators or things like that. But, you know, we've been seeing it's kind of some increasing challenges related to kind of sharing data with that could be used potentially by pharmaceutical companies, for example, to advance drug development and things like that. And so I think as we're kind of moving forward and we're talking about moving things, data sharing forward, we really just kind of have to make sure that we're using the same words to mean, and I think somebody said this right at the beginning, like a common kind of terminology and common kind of understanding of the terminologies. And I think that's really key, so that we're all talking about the same things and we all know that we're talking about the same things. And obviously that is a Herculean task, but I think it's important to really think about, because I think, at least from my experiences, when you talk to patients and they say, I don't want it to be used for commercial my data to be used for commercial purposes, they don't mean I don't want, like, potential, some may, but like many don't mean I don't want drug companies to be able to look at this data to kind of try to look for a cure or a treatment. They mean like, I don't want a data aggregator profiting off of me, and, you know, with no potential benefit for me or society type thing.
Thanks, Robin. So we are going to leave this group map open. Please feel free to stay here, continue to populate this with your expectations that you have for the different stakeholders. This will actively feed into our stakeholder expectations matrix. But for the purpose of time, we now need to wrap this up. Diana, if you could transition back to the slides here for us. We're going to move forward with carrying through interviews, and we'll process this information that you've given us today. One of the things that we also want to do is post this session. We are going to post a survey, and if you close out of the Zoom webinar, you will also get a survey where in that survey, you have the opportunity to tell us if you would like to be interviewed as part of the stakeholder expectations matrix. So we also have this opportunity to continue to feed the group map, to feed the broader interviews, but then also let us know if partaking in these interviews is something that you would like to be a part of as an interviewee. Thank you very much for joining us. Nicola, any closing remarks on your end as well?
Maybe just to thank the audience for all the contribution. I've been scanning all the responses that you are putting in there, and that will really help us shape the questions and actually bring around the table the people or the right stakeholders that are not yet around the table. So thank you very much for that. And as Elizabeth said, you can continue to be part of that exercise, and we will be in touch as part of PEOF and separately to share the progress of this work. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.